This podcast is a member of the Place to Be Nation family. Visit us at placetobenation.com, the only place to be in your pop culture world.
Place to Be Nation, welcome back to another edition of Making Mount Rushmore here on the PTV Pop Experience. I am your host / moderator, Steve Riddle, and today we've got a really good episode because we're delving into the world of sports. It's been a while since we've done that, so it's good to get in here. And to do so, I have two great gentlemen on with me. Was going to have a third, but he had to pull out, unfortunately. I'll get to him in a second. We have a guy making his debut and a returning guest, so let's go ahead and bring him in. First, we'll bring in the debut. You can usually hear him here on the pop feed with the relatively new show, PTP's Top 10. It is Mr. Scott Grimes. Scott, how are you?
I'm doing well, Steve. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to make my debut here, and hopefully I get called back after some of my hot takes on this show.
Oh, yeah, it's always great to have some new voices on, and especially when it's something that they really enjoy. I know you've said that sports is one of your biggest things, so it's good to have you on.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited for our topic tonight because it's something that, is pretty near and dear to my heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And also joining us is as I like to joke now, he's pretty much become my almost my co-host on the show with how many times he's been on now. But you can usually find him over here on the Pop Experience as part of the Video Jukebox Song of the Day. And, of course, as part of the great show Greetings from Allentown, it is my good friend Keith Langston. Keith, how are you, sir?
I'm doing wonderful, Steve. How are you?
I'm good. Always good to have you in that. I keep joking that your name's practically in that seat. You've been in it so often.
I'll take that as a compliment. It's like the Jackie chair on Howard Stern. I'm the Artie chair now. So no, I love it. I love making Mount Rushmore. It's a great opportunity for us to visit any kind of pop or now sports themes. I mean, this is a great one too because just a lot of laughs I had when we started looking at the busts because I was like, "Ha, that's right, that guy played football." So yeah, it's going to be pretty good, I think. So, and I'm excited that Scott's here as well. So this is great.
Yep, it is. And I mentioned we were supposed to have a third gentleman on with us. The Cowboy, Roger Morrissette, was going to join us. Sadly, he had to pull out at the last minute, but I do have his list here. And fitting he was going to be on given our topic today because, as you know, it is the month of April, and one of the big events us sports fans are looking forward to this month is, of course, the NFL Draft. Mm-hmm. Of course, we wait to see which guys coming out of college are going to get picked by our favorite teams, who's going to be the guy to kind of be the guys that are going to be those final pieces to put it all together. So I figured it would be fun to do two Mount Rushmore's here based on the NFL Draft. And for our first block here, we're going to be talking about our picks for the number one draft picks. Of course, as we all know, one of the things we look forward to is who's going to be that first guy to get picked. We hear the likes of like Mel Kiper and all those analysts and talk about who's going to be number one, which team's going to get elusive number one pick. Of course, this year it was originally supposed to be who was supposed to be? I know the Panthers have it now, but they traded up for it. So
the Bears.
The Bears, that's who it was. They, of course, were supposed to be number one. Like I said, Carolina now has traded up to number one. But let's now go ahead and talk about who we think are our best number one picks. And Scott, we'll go ahead and start with you. Give us the first entry on your Mount Rushmore of number one draft picks.
Yeah, all right. So the first election for me, I felt like this is pretty appropriate. I think that this is an individual who was kind of more than just a football player. He kind of transcended the league, and I think he's still very relevant, even though he's been retired for a while now. But he was the first overall pick in 1998, and I went with Peyton Manning as my first selection. And I think that it's quite obvious. I mean, he's a 5-time MVP. He has 2 Super Bowl wins. He's one of the greatest passers that's ever played the game. I think that if you're showing a kid who's getting into the sport, how to throw a football, I think Peyton Manning is the tape that you give him because it was just so effortless and he just made it look so easy. Like I said, he won a Super Bowl for 2 different franchises, so completely changed the fates of more than one franchise, and everything you want out of a first-round pick, everything you want out of a football player and out of a person, still very involved. He's got, he's doing the ESPN cast, so he is Mr. Football, and I think that if you're having a Mount Rushmore of quarterbacks, of football players, or of number 1 draft picks, Peyton Manning should be on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I know. Like I said, I didn't make my own list, but if I did, he would definitely be my number 1. And I know Roger had him on his Mount Rushmore as well. I mean, he's the perfect example of a class act in football. You hear, you have all these guys that, they have character issues and everything, but Peyton was just absolute, masterclass. In terms of being a professional. He obviously cared about the sport. He loved the sport. He took the Colts from a dull franchise to a winning team, winning the Super Bowl with them, and then again doing the same with the Broncos. And I'm sure, I don't know how it was when, because when he got voted into the Hall of Fame, I'm sure he was easily a unanimous pick because he definitely deserved it. And you always hear about the Manning versus Brady war. He was just always the guy that you could always rely on for being so, solid and a true sportsman. And he definitely was worthy of being the first pick in 1998 when he got drafted. And Keith, you had him on your Mount Rushmore as well, as we make it a clean sweep.
Mm-hmm. I did. And I think not only is Peyton Manning, now being a New England Patriots fan, obviously I'm supposed to hate Peyton Manning. But I can't, because I think that you're absolutely right. He's a class act. He's a leader. He's the kind of guy that if you're going to build a team and a franchise around, you do want to put him in there, especially considering that he was the number 1 overall pick in that draft in 98. And not only that, I mean, his personality is just phenomenal. I mean, I've seen him host Saturday Night Live, and he's always done a great job with that. He's been in commercials. He's been on television. He does this. He does that. I mean, he's the kind of guy that NFL wants to have as like their poster child, because he is not only meets the definition of a number 1 overall pick, he meets the definition of a class act, he meets the definition as a superstar quarterback. He's also got the personality to go a long way. It was a no-brainer to put him on. And I think that he's absolutely, was first ballot Hall of Famer. I'm not sure if he went unanimous or not, but I'm probably did. Football, I feel that the Football Hall of Fame vote is a lot more based off of your statistics and stuff like that, as opposed to baseball, where they love to, just bury people because they don't like them. So I'm sure he was a unanimous, but yeah, Peyton Manning, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those MasterCard commercials he did were some of the funniest they've ever done.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
He had such a charisma about him, and it just came so natural to him. So.
Yeah, and considering that, like, his counterpart being like Tom Brady, where Tom Brady's not the most personality, like it doesn't flow as well for him as it did for Peyton Manning. So it was always fun to see Peyton, watch him play and watch him get beat. I will say that it was always fun to watch the Patriots beat the Colts and then the Broncos. So yeah, good times.
Yeah, well, you knew there was always that mutual respect between the two of them, so you can't get that anywhere else.
Right.
All right, well, Keith, let's go to you now. Give us the next entry on your Mount Rushmore of number 1 draft picks.
Well, I will say this: Hall of Famer, 3-time Pro Bowler, 1-time All-Pro, 4-time Super Bowl champ, 1978 MVP, 2-time Super Bowl MVP. Of course, I'm talking about the man who was drafted in the class of 1970 overall number 1 quarterback, Terry Bradshaw. So I think Bradshaw is, if Peyton Manning is the man that he is today, I feel like Terry Bradshaw was the first to do it. I mean, the guy was unbelievable when he played, and then he's just continued his career, his second career, let's just say, as to be just a model citizen, a class act, another guy who's just exactly what the NFL was looking for when they have, a number one draft pick kind of thing. I always liked Terry Bradshaw. I unfortunately I didn't get to see many of his games. I was born pretty much past his prime in his career, so I was born the year after he won the MVP. So, but getting to see video and stuff like that whenever they play highlights of his games and things like that, he was unbelievable. And for somebody in a position like that as a quarterback, he led his team, like I said, 4 Super Bowls. Hell of a guy, hell of a player, hell of a, I have, my father-in-law used to talk about watching Terry Bradshaw and stuff. So, just number 1 overall on this. I mean, he was listed number 1, but he could easily be my number 2. Like, if we're putting them in the positions, I know we don't necessarily rank 1, 2, 3, 4 on the Mount Rushmore, but he's up there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And Roger had him on his Mount Rushmore as well. He was definitely the anchor for that Steelers team, because when you think of this, the Steelers of the 70s, you always think of the Steel defense. Mm-hmm. But he helmed a really good offense that helped lead them to 4 Super Bowls and helped make them the dynasty of the 1970s. I mean, without him, who knows what that offense would have been like. I mean, you can have the greatest defense in the world, but if your offense isn't scoring points, mm-hmm. It doesn't matter in the end. So he was definitely, like I said, the kind of the anchor and the glue that held that offense together. And like you said, I mean, he's probably as well known today by the younger fans just for his time on Fox as mm-hmm. an analyst than he was for his on the field career. So, he's definitely another one of those guys that transcended the sport from being an on the field player to an off the field analyst. So he definitely deserves to be up there. Scott, do you have anything else to say about Terry Bradshaw?
Yeah, he just narrowly kind of missed it for me. He would have been, if Mount Rushmore could expand to 5 or 6, I think I would have had Bradshaw on there. And I think that a lot of it is what Keith kind of alluded to, which is most of that is, I mean, all of that is before I was born. And, a lot of it has going back and watching NFL films and, seeing the highlights and things like that. I think that he probably gets overshadowed now with the success of a Tom Brady with all those Super Bowls, or a Joe Montana, and some of these other perennial first ballot quarterbacks. I think Bradshaw probably gets overlooked, and I think also some of that is because when you think of the Steelers, obviously you think Bradshaw, but you also think about the defense, and so people say, well, they didn't win the Super Bowls because of Bradshaw. Which is debatable, but like you kind of mentioned, Steve, you can have the greatest defense. You still need at least a good enough quarterback to get you there, even back then when, offenses weren't putting out the numbers that we're used to today. But nothing but respect and adoration for Terry Bradshaw. And I think, again, he's a guy that's continued to be a part of the game and have it in his life, all of this time. And so you can tell he loves the sport, he loves the game, and he's always involved. And you never really hear anyone say anything bad about Terry Bradshaw as a person. And I think that plays a part into this as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I mean, and like I said, yeah, you think of the 70s defense, but of course then you have the immaculate reception, which, he was, it wasn't his intention.
He threw the pass. He threw the pass.
He threw the pass that went that led Franco to get it. So he'll always have that in his in that as well. So. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and give another one of Roger's picks, and this is an interesting one because there was the hotly debated, when you think about what was happening that year, the fact that if this guy had played with the team that had actually drafted him, how things could have been differently. But of course, we all remember in 1983 when John Elway was drafted number 1 by the Baltimore Colts, but he basically flat out said he does not want to play. And he ended up getting drafted, and he ended up going to the Broncos, and he ended up parlaying it into a great career. Obviously, multi-time Super Bowl appearances, 2 championships, helped lead the Broncos again, kind of to become one of the best teams of the 80s and the 90s. And he's of course still there now. Well, he was there. I think he's still there now as a front office guy. But just all that rigmarole surrounding the fact that he did not want to play for the Colts. And again, like I said, if they had not given him away to the Broncos and they kept him around, how much his career would have changed because of that. But you obviously can't deny the impact he would end up having with the Broncos, and what he would end up doing as a as a football player and as a champion. And I know, Keith, you had him on your Mount Rushmore as well.
I did, yes. And one of the things I had always liked about John Elway was, I mean, during the first couple of Super Bowl appearances where he loses, and you kind of felt bad, and then he gets Terrell Davis, and then he has those amazing back-to-back Super Bowls in the 90s, which was just, it was great. It was great for me to see that he was able to get to that next level. I always felt that he was going to go the way of Dan Marino and just not be able to get over that, no pun intended, but over the goal line, and just win. And when he finally was able to get the back-to-backs, I was like, this is great. This is exactly what he deserves. And yeah, I mean, and I feel that he's very much like how Nolan Ryan is in baseball, kind of being the part ownership of the team and just really being strict to his style of baseball. John Elway is very much like that with Denver and his way of how he wants to control that team, from the front office football way. So I think that he's obviously going to have a hell of a second career, whether it's, being in the management of the team or whatever the case is. But yeah, John Elway, you're absolutely right. Maybe if he had gone to Baltimore, they wouldn't have moved. And they would have stayed in Baltimore. They would have been the Colts still, but you never know. What could have been?
Yeah, what could have been? I mean, you think about it, kind of funny you mentioned Marino, because Marino was in that same draft. Of course, he went much later. Mm-hmm. He went number 27. Of course, right after Elway actually was one of the best running backs of the time, Eric Dickerson. And that same draft also had Jim Kelly. So some big names to come out of that draft. And obviously, it's debated if where Elway, you think of Elway, Kelly, and Marino when you think of that draft. So yeah. And we have another clean sweep as Scott, you had Elway on your Mount Rushmore as well.
I did, and I think it's funny that we kind of transitioned from Terry Bradshaw to John Elway, because I think that was John Elway was kind of the first it guy quarterback, since that 1970 draft. You hadn't really seen those sort of slam dunk, no matter what, this guy's getting drafted number one overall, which became more common afterward. But Elway was really kind of that first one since Bradshaw. And I mean, just an incredible career. There's several things that I find interesting. One is what you mentioned, Steve, that 83 draft with Jim Kelly and Dan Marino, and obviously a lot of other Hall of Fame players as well, like Darrell Green, Bruce Matthews, Dickerson. But for Elway to be kind of at the top of that class speaks volumes for him as a player. The other interesting thing about John Elway is, he was an incredible quarterback and he had a great arm and was a great passer. And yet a lot of people's memories of him is that touchdown run in the Super Bowl there. So I always kind of find that interesting that that's a lot of people's kind of go-to highlight when you go back and remember John Elway. And then, yeah, really the what if he did just play for the Colts. They probably don't move. There may not be a Baltimore Ravens. Peyton Manning is not a Colt, most likely, because if Elway stays and plays through 98, there's no way they're losing enough games to draft Peyton Manning. So it really is an interesting what if and a ripple effect if he did play for the Colts. But also he could have just flamed out and been a bust and been on our other list later on had he stayed. We'll never know. But an incredible kind of, again, role model for the sport, someone who was the face of the NFL for, a good 15 years. I remember in third grade, I had a John Elway Valentine's card that I gave to my third grade teacher because, he was just the best player that came in that pack of Valentine's Day cards. And I thought to myself, well, if anyone deserves this John Elway card, it's probably my teacher, not one of my friends who won't appreciate it. So John Elway was, great player. As an executive, the jury's still kind of out and people kind of have mixed reviews on how he's done. But again, with the running theme here, another guy who's still involved in the sport. And I think we're kind of seeing that a lot of that criteria plays into this Mount Rushmore. Is not only what did you do as a player, but what have you done to elevate the sport after that? And so far we've had Manning and Bradshaw and Elway, all guys who have continued to keep the sport close to their hearts, since their retirements. And so far they're all on the Mount Rushmores for us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think I can't remember if it was you or Keith who said it's like if we're doing a quarterbacks Mount Rushmore, you can easily include all three of these guys. That's how great they've been to the sport. So definitely well deserved. Okay, well, let's go back around to Scott. Give us the next entry on your Mount Rushmore of number one draft picks.
Yeah, so this next one, to me, I was trying to have a little bit of variety and get away from the quarterback position. And so when I decided I wanted to at least have one non-quarterback entry, I immediately knew that it had to be this gentleman, because he is arguably the greatest pass rusher defensive end of all time. And of course, I'm talking about Bruce Smith, who was drafted number one overall in 1985 by the Bills, 200 career sacks, record holder there. Obviously, led the Bills to all of those Super Bowls, even though they didn't win any of them. But he was the anchor of that defense and the leader in the locker room for that team. 11 Pro Bowl selections, eight-time All-Pro first team, which is, incredible for a position where, sometimes the lifespan is kind of 8 to 12 years. And for him to do it for as long as he did, for 15, just kind of spoke volumes to his dedication to the game. He was always in excellent shape. Wasn't really an injury-prone guy, which you see also a lot in defensive players, but he was very durable, always on the field. Someone that you could really build a defense around. That's exactly what the Bills did. Yes, they had Jim Kelly and Thurman Thomas, Andre Reed, that incredible offense. But again, you could have a terrific offense, and if your defense isn't getting the job done, then it doesn't matter. And Bruce Smith was the guy on the other side, making sure that the offense could get back on the field, forcing those 3-and-outs and quarterback sacks and fumbles and things of that nature. So, one of the greatest defensive players of all time, and I think it's lucky that, he ended up being drafted first overall, because that was a slam dunk selection. So Bruce Smith absolutely deserves to be on my Mount Rushmore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Like you said, one of the greatest defensive ends in the game, and it was interesting because obviously '85, this was the year that all the teams passed up on Jerry Rice because they weren't 100% convinced that he was going to be a star, and of course the 49ers took a chance on him and never looked back with them. But yeah, when you look at this class, again, it's some pretty good names in there. Besides Rice, you have Bill Fralick, you had Andre Reed, Randall Cunningham, who went in the second round. So for Bruce Smith to be number one, they obviously saw something special in him, and he obviously proved it on the field with being one of the all-time sack leaders, and like I said, all those Pro Bowl selections. He was with them for their all four of their Super Bowl appearances, and I think just still goes down, like you said, as one of the best defensive ends in the game in its history. Keith, do you have anything else to say about Bruce Smith?
Yeah, two-time Defensive Player of the Year. In the voting in 8 and 90 for MVP. That's I usually say, like, offense wins games, defense wins championships. Unfortunately, they didn't win any championships with them, but it wasn't for lack of trying. I think go to the Super Bowl 4 times in a row, it speaks volumes to just the defensive capability that they had in those games. So, Bruce Smith, excellent pick, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, Keith, you've got one entry left on your Mount Rushmore, so why don't you go ahead and give it to us?
I do, and this was a little controversial, I feel like, because while he is known for football, he's also more known for baseball, and that's Bo Jackson. And now I know Bo, he could probably go on. I feel like he could be on an either or, as either a draft, on Mount Rushmore or a bust, because, like I said, he didn't play many. He only played 4 years in the NFL. But he was electrifying. You know what I mean? He was amazing to watch. And, he came in second in Rookie of the Year in 1987. And, originally drafted in 1986 by Tampa Bay. And then he ended up, not playing in 86. And then he got drafted again in 87. So he kind of sneaks in on that list as kind of a technicality. But, Bo Jackson, I remember seeing him, on both playing for the Raiders and then playing for the Royals. Just amazing guy, amazing athlete. Overall, I think cut down in his prime by injury. Probably had he not been injured, he probably could have been, I would say Hall of Famer on both sides, both sports. So, but I always loved Bo Jackson.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another interesting one. He was very recognizable to me. Tecmo Bo. That's really all you need to say.
Yeah.
And I think, like I said, he was a guy that could have gone to either sport and done really well, but unfortunately the injuries kind of caught up to him, and I think it definitely cut short what could have been a really great career. I don't know if I would have gone as far as to put him as a bust, just because of what he was able to do. But I think when you look back on like the number one picks, I think he's definitely an interesting choice there. Scott, do you have anything else to say about Bo Jackson?
Yeah, I mean, right off the bat, he certainly makes the two-sport athlete Mount Rushmore, right? He's probably right in the center of that one. Him and Deion Sanders and a couple other guys. I do think that if he probably focused on one sport, like Keith said, I would agree. He's probably a Hall of Famer in that sport, whichever one he chose. I think that kind of going back and forth attributed to a lot of the injuries, unfortunately, because you're using different types of muscles in different parts of your body. And so you're not resting anything when you're going back and forth like that. So I certainly think that was unfortunate, but also fortunate because, I mean, he really just transcended both sports. I mean, he was a pop culture icon, all the Bo Knows ads and the commercials and, him showing up on TV shows. And he really had that crossover appeal, was one of the first guys to really make that full jump, into media and not just sports. I mean, recognizable by people who didn't even watch football or baseball, and they knew who Bo Jackson was. And so when he was on the field, football, we're talking about football. So football wise, I mean, the combination of size and speed was something that really hadn't been seen since an individual who may or may not have done it with the gloves and other things that were going on with him. But really, just kind of that rare hybrid sort of running back that had the size and, was built like a linebacker, but had the speed of a running back. And so, I mean, he was just a freak of nature, honestly. And I do believe that, like I said, had he stuck to one sport, he's a Hall of Famer in that sport. Hell, if he played basketball, he's probably a Hall of Famer there too, just because of how athletic he was. And so, great choice, just because I think it's always great to talk about Bo Jackson and kind of give him his due. Obviously didn't make my Rushmore because, unfortunately it was, cut too short, but I also can't be mad at the pick because, if you're looking to get something out of a number one pick and it's more than just a great player, it's someone you can build a franchise, and not only that, but build sort of an entire league around. Like, he was kind of the face of the NFL for a few years there. And so if you're getting that out of a number one pick, I think that is enough criteria to at least be in the conversation for a Mount Rushmore. So I have no issues with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, Scott, you have one entry left on your Mount Rushmore, so why don't you go ahead and give it to us?
I do. This one was tough, trying to get, that last one. There are a lot of names that I considered, and, a couple running backs and a few more quarterbacks, an offensive lineman. But ultimately, I thought to myself, when I'm looking back on my Mount Rushmore, out of a number one pick, like, what are you looking to get out of your number one pick? If you're a team and a franchise, you want someone obviously who's going to change the fortunes of your franchise and, bring you from mediocrity to, being a perennial playoff team. You want someone who's going to be the face of your franchise and someone that you can build around from a culture standpoint, right? Who's going to, uplift teammates and, never really cause any issues. And then you want someone that's durable, someone that, you can depend on and you can count on to be a part of your franchise for 12 to 15 years, all those things that you're kind of looking for. And then when I go back and I look at people's careers, I have to go, okay, well, what are the first things that come to mind for these players? And when they showed up, did it matter? Are they padding their stats in a fourth quarter, loss where they're down by 20 and the stats look great? Or are they coming through, making big throws in clutch situations, going out there winning championships? And so when I thought about all of that, I didn't expect to have this person as my final selection. But looking back, I had to go with Eli Manning. Because, again, just first overall in 2004, very similar to John Elway, said he wouldn't play for the Chargers, was able to force the trade to the Giants in the swap for Phillip Rivers, and another great quarterback class with him, Rivers, and Ben Roethlisberger. But more than just that, I mean, obviously, sorry, Keith, but two-time Super Bowl champion, beating New England twice in the Super Bowl, before the Eagles, I mean, the only team that could defeat the Patriots, it seemed like. So, he had that magic potion or whatever it was when it came to Tom Brady and Bill Belichick. He was just able to overcome them. And both games were incredible. You have the David Tyree catch. You have the Mario Manningham catch in those Super Bowls. He's the one making those throws. He's leading those clutch drives at the end, staying composed. And he was also, durable. I mean, he didn't miss a game for, almost 15 years straight. And so someone that was always on the field, you knew he was always going to be there. And again, just like his brother, someone that you could kind of put the league on its back and say, go out there, be a poster child for us, be a role model for kids. And that's exactly what he did. So thinking about not only the 2 Super Bowls, but the fact that it was the Patriots dynasty and one of them, they were undefeated going into the game. I just felt like those clutch performances put him over the top for me. So that's why he made my my last spot in my Mount Rushmore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, like you said, that was again an interesting situation where he got drafted by the Chargers. He didn't want to go, so they finagled something with the Giants so that Phillip Rivers would go to the Chargers and Eli went to the Giants. If that does not happen, does the career for both guys end up drastically differently? But like you said, I mean, the Giants, he was a good linchpin for them. And like you said, they seemed to be the only ones that could figure out the Patriots in the Super Bowl. I mean, they prevented them from the perfect season and then proved in the second time that it wasn't a fluke. And yeah, I mean, he's just a guy that I think kind of gets misunderstood a little bit because I feel like, he's got 2 rings, but there have been, he's probably not got the same stance as Peyton does. But I mean, you can't deny with the outcome and what the ultimate end game was is that he did, get 2 Super Bowl rings, and again they weren't fluke wins. They were definitely decisive wins, and he definitely deserves a lot of credit for leading those 2 teams to the victory, and he's definitely worthy of a spot here. Keith, do you have anything to say about Eli Manning?
Oh boy, I mean, you're asking.
I know. Sorry, Keith.
You're asking for a lot from as much as because let's put it this way: as much as I love Peyton Manning, I hate Eli Manning. I mean, he is just, he's like the bane of the Patriots' existence. It is so hard for me to say anything positive about the man. I'll say this: he was a first-round draft pick. I will say, he did win 2 Super Bowls. I'm gonna go the Ron Swanson route where he just lists facts. No, I mean I think Eli is he did lead his team when he had to. He was clutch when he had to be, and I'm not gonna take that away from the guy. I think I just feel that all the talent in the Manning family went to Peyton, and Eli just kind of like was there. But no, I'm not going to take it away. The guy was talented. He obviously didn't have the I feel like the extended run that like Peyton did, where it really was like Peyton's last season was kind of like his worst season, where I feel like he was just injured half the time. But Eli kind of fell off, I feel like, the last couple of years. But you know what? He's deserving, I think, to at least be in the discussion. I'll give you that. It's so hard for me to say anything positive about the guy that single-handedly destroyed me.
Well, don't feel bad. If Roger was here, he'd probably be in the same boat you were. So
yeah, if you don't want to go down the road of the officials costing the Patriots that Super Bowl, then I guess we got to say it's Eli's responsibility.
No doubt. Okay, well, Roger's got one last name on his Mount Rushmore, so I will go ahead and talk about it. And if I was doing a Mount Rushmore myself, he would definitely be on mine as well. And obviously, me being a Cowboys fan, I am very glad that he put him on here. And of course, that was Troy Aikman in 1989. Of course, that class itself was a pretty loaded one because not only do you have him, you had Barry Sanders, Derek Thomas, and Deion Sanders all in the top 5 as well. So pretty loaded class. Obviously, Dallas had bottomed out by the mid to late 80s. Jerry Jones came in, he forced Tom Landry out. Jimmy Johnson came in, and he knew he had to basically start from the ground up. So he drafts Aikman. They end up going. I believe that was the year they went 1-15, but of course they would go on to get Michael Irvin and Emmitt Smith later down the line to form that great trinity, and they would go on to become the dynasty of the 90s. So it obviously all worked out in the end. Aikman had a hell of a run at the quarterback position. He, like I said, helped resuscitize that franchise, and obviously now he's again, kind of gotten a little second career as a commentator, and he'll always definitely be remembered for being one of the linchpins of the Cowboys being one of the greatest teams of the '90s. So, very happy again that Roger put him on his Mount Rushmore. Scott, do you have anything else to say about Troy Aikman?
Yeah, he was just a near miss for me. He was very close to making my list as well. Again, talk about one of the faces of the NFL during the '90s. I mean, consistently in the playoffs with those Cowboys teams. And people will make the argument that, he kind of just did what he had to do for them to win. And it was, Emmitt Smith and Michael Irvin and the defense and Deion Sanders and all those. But you know what? Again, like we've been mentioning, if your job is to go out there and not lose the game, then you're doing what you're supposed to do. He didn't always have the best stats, Troy Aikman. He never threw for 25 touchdowns in a season. There were a few seasons there where, he'd have like 13 touchdowns, 12 interceptions and things like that. So, the numbers don't look gaudy. They don't look like Marino's numbers or Elway's or Montana's or Steve Young's, the guys that were his contemporaries. The stats aren't there, but obviously the Super Bowls are there. The ability to lead his team is there. He always had the respect of his teammates, and once again, someone who's involved in the sport still to this day. So nothing but respect for Troy Aikman. And like I said, if this was, if Mount Rushmore had, 6 or 7 spots, he'd be on it for me as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Keith?
It's always interesting because I feel that, a Mount Rushmore for draft picks is probably always going to be quarterbacks. And I mean, Aikman fits that completely, and I think that, you got, Aikman, hell of a player. Yeah, he had some assistance from other people on the team and things like that. But I don't think that he was just, I don't think he earns a spot. He earns a spot on that. And I mean, the Cowboys were America's team for machines.
Absolutely, I definitely agree. Okay, well that will go ahead and wrap up our main list here. So let's go ahead and talk about any honorable mentions that we haven't brought up yet. Scott, do you have any that you want to mention?
I did. So apart from obviously Bradshaw and Aikman, who we talked about, I had Earl Campbell, kind of as an honorable mention there. We talk about, a lot of times running backs towards the top of the draft, it's really hit or miss. But obviously Earl Campbell, one of the greatest running backs of all time. To go away from quarterback, I also had Orlando Pace, who was the number 1 overall pick in 1997 for the Rams. Led the greatest show on turf. He was the guy that protected Kurt Warner. He's the guy that blocked for Marshall Faulk. Just the model of consistency at left tackle, which is one of the more important positions on the field, and he was able to hold that down for well over a decade. It's tough for offensive linemen, to get a lot of love, right? So I wanted to shout out Orlando Pace. And then the last one for me, this might be a little bit of a hot take, but I think because of the way he's kind of flamed out in the past few years is taken away from what he did for the first 6 or 7 years of his career. But Cam Newton was someone that I considered because, number 1 overall pick, he's got an MVP. He led a team to the Super Bowl. They had a 15-1 season, and really someone who, there were dual threat quarterbacks, of course, before Cam Newton, your Michael Vicks and your, Warren Moon, Steve Young. But the way that Cam did it, just being that bowling ball at the goal line, just knowing every single time within, the 5-yard line, it was going to Cam. He was getting the ball. He was running it in every single time consistently. He was doing the Superman celebration, another guy that was kind of the face of the league for a few years there. So I think had it lasted a little bit longer and there were more sustained success, you can make an argument for Cam Newton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. All good choices there. Obviously, like I said, Earl Campbell, one of the best running backs in history. Orlando Pace, kind of one of the unsung heroes of that greatest show on turf, like you mentioned. And yeah, Cam Newton. I mean, he was definitely he helped again rejuvenate the Panthers, but I feel like after that loss in the Super Bowl, that started the downward spiral for him, and it is a shame that it's kind of gone that way for him. You hope that maybe he will be able to turn around at some point before he ends up calling it a day. Okay, Keith, do you have any other honorable mentions that we haven't talked about yet?
I do. So I have one important one here, and that is again, being a New England fan, this is the house that Drew built is Gillette Stadium. And that, of course, is Drew Bledsoe. Earlier, Scott was talking about a guy who comes in, rejuvenates a franchise, brings them from, mediocrity or obscurity into the prime time. A person that you build a franchise around, a person who is just the future for somebody that, for a team or a franchise that just needs a breath of fresh air. And Drew Bledsoe was it. I was very lucky to see pretty much all of Drew Bledsoe's career. And, having vague recollections of what the Patriots were prior to him. After, of course, they went to the Super Bowl and against the Bears, and then, there was the dark times, and then they came back with Drew, and Drew led them to the Super Bowl, where they lost to Green Bay. But it was him and Parcells, and Drew Bledsoe hung around, and I was actually at the game that Drew Bledsoe got hit, and he was out, and Tom Brady came in. And I remember in that season just thinking, Jesus, are we really going to have like a quarterback controversy? And knowing that this was Brady's team now, and then when Drew went to Buffalo and had a couple of successful years, and then I think he ended up in Dallas, and it was just kind of the end. It kind of petered out for him, but for years he was there. He kept the Patriots very competitive, very good enough, and I saw several games with him where I was at the stadium and got to cheer the team on, and it was, and he was like a cultural icon kind of in the New England area as well. I know when I was in high school, the quarterback on my football team, he wanted to wear number 11 because of Drew Bledsoe. And in fact, even when like another player from the Patriots gets number 11, I'm always like, do we really want to do that? Like, I kind of feel like that number should be reserved, just not retired, but just reserved for, maybe a star player. I think Julian Edelman wore number 11. So I was like, all right, that's okay. So, yeah, but no, Drew Bledsoe I had. And then kind of a recent first round pick, but I've seen flashes of brilliance from this guy. And it wouldn't surprise me if he carries on and continues to have like an amazing career. And that's quarterback Joe Burrow. I think he's a dynamic quarterback. I think he obviously made it to the Super Bowl last year, and I think great things. I think another guy who went to a franchise that was kind of floundering around for a little while, and hopefully he's going to bring some glory back to Cincinnati. And I'm kind of like I guess a sentimental Bengals fan where I always want I was actually, when we go back to Bono's Tecmo Bowl, I used to always play as the Cincinnati Bengals because it was the Boomer Esiason team. And so I'm always kind of like a secret Bengals fan. So I think Joe Burrow's the kind of guy that can lead them to glory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are two good ones. Like you said, Bledsoe kind of was the helped bring the Patriots back to prominence in the mid '90s. And you forget the year that the Patriots fought the Rams in the Super Bowl. Bledsoe was the quarterback in the championship game and helped them get there. So
yep, absolutely.
Even though that ended up being Brady's team, Bledsoe definitely was kind of one last little great moment for him in New England before he left. And then, like you say, went to Buffalo, and he did go to Dallas. He was the quarterback for Dallas before Romo took over. So
he got hurt and Romo took over just like with Brady. It was kind of deja vu actually for Bledsoe, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, except the only difference is Sally Romo never got a Super Bowl, so honestly, the one difference there. Okay, and like you said about I think Burrow definitely has a great career ahead of him as long as he stays healthy, and the Bengals keep all the weapons around him. I think they'll definitely remain a strong contender going forward. So definitely good choices there. Couple of other ones I was thinking about that I'm just kind of seeing here. That weren't mentioned. I do have to give the guy his due because, when Matthew Stafford got drafted in 2009, the Lions were just coming off, being the first team to be 0-16, and they were at absolute rock bottom, and he helped kind of bring that franchise back around with Calvin Johnson. Sadly, they never got to the Super Bowl, but Stafford got his Bowl ring last year, so I thought he definitely merited a recognition. mentioned earlier, Michael Vick, another guy who was such a firebrand when he got drafted. That was, of course, the year it was down to between him and LaDainian Tomlinson, and he was the kind of guy the Falcons needed. Obviously, he unfortunately kind of self-destructed there a little bit, and would have a little bit of a bounce back with the Eagles, but not to the level he was once at. And then one more kind of old school guy, even though the guy himself is his character is obviously questionable, but in '69 when O.J. Simpson got drafted number 1, he was he at the time was considered a guy that could turn a franchise around. And of course, if you remember going the year before, I think the Eagles were originally in contention to get him, but they won like 2 meaningless games and lost that chance, and the Bills ended up drafting him. So, but yeah, I thought again for what he was able to bring to the table at that time, it was definitely I think worth mentioning.
I would say I was going to say about OJ, I mean, I'm pretty sure, Scott, you're a wrestling fan as well, correct?
Of course.
Yeah, so I mean, we're all wrestling fans. I mean, we always have there's always this discussion going on in the online community about, he who shall not be named, and whether or not you ever want to consider him, good for what he committed to the ring, and then, unfortunately for the weekend that ended at the end of his life is what he's probably known for. OJ's almost in the same kind of discussion when it comes to that. I mean, OJ was unbelievable as a running back. I mean, he was awesome, and it's like, oh God, if he just didn't have that dark cloud hanging over him. I mean, OJ is like, he's on the Mount Rushmore, I think, of everybody's Mount Rushmore, So I kind of agree with that as at least being an honorable mention, Steve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, that will go ahead and wrap up this first half. Had a lot of great discussion, talking some great number 1 picks, but we're going to go ahead and take a break, and when we come back, we're going to flip the script a bit and talk about guys that maybe could have been on the same level as those guys we just talked about, but instead flamed out. So this is, of course, Making Rushmore here on the Pop Experience, and we'll be back on the other side of this break. And we're back on Making Mount Rushmore here on the Pop Experience. I am Steve Riddle here with Scott Grimes and Keith Langston, of course, Roger Morrissette in spirit. It is now the second half, if you will, since we are talking football. We had the first half talking the our number one draft picks that we thought deserved to be on Mount Rushmore. We took our halftime, and now we're here in the second half, and we're going to be talking about a collection of guys who are in a position where nobody wants to be when it comes to being drafted, and that is, of course, we are talking about the best NFL draft busts. These are the guys that went into their draft with a lot of potential. They seemed like guys that were going to be the next big thing. Had basically the world at their fingertips. Seemed like the guys that were going to be the final piece for these teams. And for whatever reason or another, whether it be injury or personal issues or just play not coming together, they ended up flaming out quickly and ultimately wound up being infamous for becoming a draft bust. And Keith, we'll go ahead and start with you this time. Give us the first entry on your Mount Rushmore of draft busts.
Oh, I'm pretty sure this is the unanimous draft of draft busts. I believe he was also a number 1 overall, and that's Ryan Leaf, quarterback Ryan Leaf. I mean, there have been probably a dozen or so documentaries based off of Ryan Leaf alone, just as far as like him, his life. He was, a collegiate star and just never, ever performed to the expectations. Got drafted by the Chargers, I believe, and just was kind of just a bust from the get-go. And then also, I think, just continued to have problems off the field as well, with trouble, I believe, with the law and just everything. So Ryan Leaf, overall, it's a shame. High expectations, high hopes, and just couldn't handle it. Couldn't handle it all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I know Roger had him on his Mount Rushmore as well. He actually was not number one, because remember the whole debate, because you said he was drafted in 98. That was, of course, the year Peyton got drafted number one.
That's right. Peyton Manning.
And, of course, that was the whole big debate of who was going to go number one. Would it be Peyton or would it be Ryan? And a lot of analysts at the time actually thought that Ryan was the better choice, just because he seemed like he had the laser arm. He helped lead Washington State to some great games, or some great seasons. Whereas a lot of people thought that Peyton was more NFL ready, as it were. And of course, the Colts, like we know, they had the number one pick. They ended up going with Manning. Like you said, the Chargers went with Ryan, and of course, we all remember that. I think it was the game against the Chiefs where he had 5 picks. And then it was after that game, of course, he had the infamous blow up in the locker room with the reporter, and it just led to an absolute downward spiral for him. He went. I think the next year they went at 15. Then of course he got let go, and that's what led the Chargers to get the Daniel Tomlinson, and he ended up, of course, he did end up playing 1 year in Dallas in 2001, but it was pretty much just a blip on the radar. And then, like you said, he got into so many legal troubles. And I remember, I think it was a few years ago, I can't remember what the thing about it was, but he did have there was a documentary about him, kind of documenting his career and the issues he was going for, and it actually seems like he's in a much better place now, that he's kind of turned his life around and he's doing a lot of good things. So hey, I'm good for him for turning his life around and becoming a better person. But unfortunately, he will always be remembered as one of, if not the biggest draft bust. And in fact, if you look at a lot of articles that do like their rankings of the biggest draft bust, he's usually number one. So definitely a very worthy choice, and it was a clean sweep. As Scott, you also had Ryan Leaf on your Mount Rushmore as well.
I did, of course. I mean, Keith said it. This is pretty much the unanimous pick when you think NFL draft bust. There's a lot of things working against Ryan Leaf. The first one being that he was drafted right after Peyton Manning. So those two are always going to be, pretty much thought of in the same sentence. And I mean, those are huge shoes to fill. That's a lot to live up to, being the one who didn't work out. To be quite honest with you, an average quarterback would have been drafted after Peyton Manning, and it would have been considered a bust. But the fact that Ryan Leaf was actually awful on the field didn't do him any favors. Then there's the fact that, right after him, the Chargers went Drew Brees and then Phillip Rivers as their franchise quarterbacks, 2 other Hall of Famers. So you look back and you say, well, okay, not only was he after Peyton Manning, but the franchise then drafted 2 Hall of Fame quarterbacks, after him. So there's that. And then you mentioned it, Steve. It was really just how epic of a meltdown it was. Not only was he a bust, there's a ton of draft busts. I mean, and, I'm sure we'll get into honorable mentions later. Like, the list goes on and on and on. But for it to be so public and for it to be so different with the anger management and yelling at reporters, and you could just tell that, mentally this guy was not in a good place. And so because it was so publicized, unfortunately, that's going to follow him around forever. So just a lot of things working against Ryan Leaf, unfortunately, added to the fact that he just wasn't a very good NFL quarterback. But yeah, he absolutely, undoubtedly had to be on my Mount Rushmore for busts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just the level of this is the combination of, going back to Peyton, like you said, and the clear immaturity that he showed on and off the field proved that he was definitely not ready for that spot. So definitely very well deserving. All right, well, Scott, we'll go to you now. Give us the next entry on your Mount Rushmore of draft busts.
So I have an individual who was drafted number 1 overall in his draft, and I think a lot of draft busts come down to not only obviously how well you didn't play, clearly, if you're a bust, but it's also who was chosen after you. And, in an alternate reality, how badly did this franchise that drafted you screw up? So for me, when you're drafted number 1 and number 2 is Hall of Famer Calvin Johnson, number 3 is Hall of Famer Joe Thomas, and number 14 is Hall of Famer Darrelle Revis, that's pretty bad. And of course, I'm talking about 2007 number 1 overall pick by the Oakland Raiders, JaMarcus Russell. This was a guy who, I mean, one of the best arms you'd ever seen in college. I mean, just throwing the ball 70 yards down the field on his knees, and all of these just different hype videos and these different things that he could do, showing off at the NFL Combine, just the combination, again, of size and speed, at the quarterback position was unbelievable. He was looked at as, kind of a can't miss prospect. And then, unfortunately, to go to a franchise like Oakland, which was obviously in complete disarray in the mid 2000s, when it came to a lot of their players having legal issues and off the field issues, et cetera. So going to that environment certainly didn't do him any favors. There's that kind of famous story about the coaches giving him the playbook for him to read over the weekend, and they didn't actually put anything in the book. So then when they asked him when he showed up the next day, hey, did you read it? He's yeah, it was great. And they intentionally put nothing in there to see if he would lie or not. So when you have stuff like that, again, you talk about immaturity at the quarterback position. I think he kind of had a sense of entitlement. It didn't seem like he really wanted to do the work, to improve as a player. When you're number one overall pick and you only last 3 years in the league, that really says something. And so the fact that he flamed out so quickly after being so highly touted and having people think he'd be the savior of a franchise that really needed it at that time, he had to make my list here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no doubt. And Roger had him on his Mount Rushmore as well. Like you said, he was just so heavily hyped that year as being, like you said, that big next can't miss prospect. And you mentioned, obviously, the three guys that came after him, Calvin Johnson, Joe Thomas, and Darrelle Revis. But you also think of guys that came after him like LaRon Landry, Adrian Peterson, Patrick Willis, Marshawn Lynch. I mean, these are, big
Steve Smith.
Steve Smith, Greg Olson. I mean, these are a lot of big names to go after him. And like you said, I think being drafted to the Raiders was not, the best may have been the best option. And I mean, he, like you said, flamed out extremely quickly, only lasting 3 years. It is unfortunate. And obviously, some of it, it does fall on him for not, like you said, not being maybe motivated enough to really get better, and to kind of make himself a better player. And it's, I think that's the thing you see a lot with these guys in this, that end up being draft busts, is that they don't want to put in the effort and they end up flaming out quickly. And I know a lot of people actually think he may have surpassed Ryan Leaf as the top draft bust of all time. Obviously that's still up for debate, but he definitely, I think, deserves to be on that list. Keith, you also had JaMarcus Russell on your Mount Rushmore as well, so we have another clean sweep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with everything the two of you have said about this. I mean, he was just, again, high praise, high promise, high everything, low reward, low return, like return on investment, terrible. And I don't think I mean, I agree with everything you guys have said already. You guys have ripped him a new one.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, I will go ahead and give another one of Roger's picks here. And this is an interesting one because when you look at him in terms of where he was drafted, he actually he was drafted in the first round as a supplemental draft pick via the Seattle Seahawks. But he was another guy that just had like the hype machine just all behind him as, being one of the next big things. And that's, of course, the man commonly referred to as the Boz, Brian Bosworth. Of course, he was drafted in 1987 by the Seahawks. And, we think back to that 87 draft where some, you had some kind of big names in there like Rod Woodson and a couple of other ones. But he was a guy that it was always kind of seen as a, just this larger than life guy. He had, he pretty much brought, a character with him in essence from when he played in Oklahoma to eventually be getting into the NFL. And, I think if I remember one time he came in on a helicopter and he was just, one of those guys that just, was so, outlandish and out there. But of course we all remember the infamous game where when the Seahawks played the Raiders and Bo Jackson pretty much, plowed him over to get into the end zone for a touchdown. And He would go on to have a decent little post-football career as a commentator. He also he was an actor and did some stuff there. And I think again he's a guy that I think as he's gotten older has definitely matured and realized what he had and what ended up could have been. But I think when you ultimately look back at him, he definitely will go down as one of the most outlandish players to have ever played the game, but also unfortunately ends up being one of the guys that you think about when you think of draft busts. And Keith, you had him on your Mount Rushmore as well.
I did, and I mean, again, you look at that '87 draft: Vinny Testaverde, Rod Woodson, Bruce Armstrong, Jim Harbaugh. I mean, some names on there. Maybe not all Hall of Famers. I don't know. I think Vinny Testaverde and Bruce Armstrong could probably make a case for that. But yeah, and then you had the Boz. I mean, if anything, it really does have to do with the fact that he brought that character with him, and you really thought that he really thinks his shit's ice cream, and and that's why it's just like, yeah, it was so kind of good to see him get a little bit of a little slapped in his face there for reality check. But yeah, did basically absolutely nothing on the field, and then just turned around and did that horrible movie that the Boz starred in. What was that? I forget what that action movie was where he thought he was going to be an action star. So yeah. Bye, Boz. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. He did a few. I'm just looking at like his at least his nice. He did Stone Cold, One Man's Justice, Back in Business. I don't know if any of those are what you were talking about, but
yeah, I mean he is. Yeah, and then he was in The Longest Yard, so I'll give him that. That's a good movie to be in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Scott, do you have anything else to say about Brian Bosworth?
I have many things to say about Brian Bosworth. The first one being that I think he just chose the wrong sport. I think that if the Boz decided to become a pro wrestler, he probably would have main evented a WrestleMania against Hulk Hogan. I mean, that would have been a perfect sort of heel character, the Boz, to go up against Hogan in that time frame. So probably just chose the wrong sport. Honestly, I think Brian Bosworth is one of the most stark examples of the system really kind of letting someone down in college at that time, where coaches were not really helping out these student athletes. He got busted for steroids, which he was doing during college, and it's like there was just no supervision. And the programs, these college programs, and there's a lot of stories that you hear about from the 80s really letting athletes down, and I think that did happen to him a lot at Oklahoma. There wasn't a lot of adult supervision. I don't think anyone was there to really set him straight, so he got busted for the steroids. He never did any of his, you hear a lot of stories that he didn't do any classwork. People would do his classwork for him. He would submit it all at the beginning of the season and then be done with it and not do any school during the football season. And then there's another story that he had someone finish it off for him so that he could declare early for the draft. Again, just a lot of things that were going kind of on behind the scenes that weren't doing him any favors, and then the injury that ended his career, the shoulder injury, which again was just from the wear and tear on his body from everything that he was, putting into his body, was unfortunate. So, I mean, and this was a guy that was looked at as, he was going to be the best linebacker, since like Jack Ham. Right. I mean, they basically made up the Butkus Award, the nation's best linebacker, for him. And he won it back-to-back in college. And so there was so much hype there. He wrote a letter to the Seahawks saying he wouldn't play for them, and then they still drafted him anyway. So I don't think he was ever happy even making it to the NFL, playing for Seattle. And just kind of the perfect storm of everything that can go wrong will go wrong for a draft prospect. And unfortunately, it does lead him to a notorious list of draft busts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no doubt. He definitely deserves to be on that ranking, on that listing there. All right, well, Scott, we'll go back around to you. Give us the next entry on your Mount Rushmore of draft busts.
Yep, this will be my last quarterback entry, and I mentioned with JaMarcus Russell, if you're, in his case, number one overall, but if you're a top 5, top 10 pick and you're a quarterback and you last 3 seasons, that's very telling. This guy lasted 2 seasons. And this was the guy that was supposed to be the bridge, for this franchise after Boomer Esiason and, before they ended up with Carson Palmer. And I'm talking about Akili Smith, who was drafted third overall in 1999 behind Tim Couch, who some people may or may not have on a bust list, but also right in between Donovan McNabb and Edgerrin James, which puts him in a really, really bad spot. And then right after that was Ricky Williams, Torrey Holt, Champ Bailey. You have Dante Culpepper in that draft, Javon Curse. So, again, just another guy that there were so many good players drafted after him. And unfortunately for Akili Smith, he lasted 2 seasons in Cincinnati, which is just kind of unheard of when it comes to quarterbacks around that time. I mean, hell, Aaron Rodgers sat behind Brett Favre for 3 seasons before he ever saw the field. Aaron Rodgers sat the bench longer than Akili Smith was in the league, which is just, crazy to think about. The fact that he had 6 touchdown passes in his career. He had less touchdown passes than his jersey number, which, again, for a quarterback is just unacceptable. So to be out of the league that quickly and, never playing. I mean, he was on the roster for a couple seasons, but he only played and saw the field for 2 years and ended up on practice squads a couple years after that, and then ended up in the CFL and NFL Europe. I mean, just a terrible selection when there are a lot of other options on the board there for Cincinnati, and this was coming off of just a few years after another huge bust that they had that I don't want to name yet just in case his name comes up later, but just a really bad time for Cincinnati there. It's nice to see that they've rebounded with Joe Burrow after all these years, but man, Akili Smith, there was so much hype there, for him to be kind of thought of neck and neck with Donovan McNabb, who we know obviously went on to have an incredible career, and for Akili Smith to be the complete opposite of that is really unfortunate, but because of that, he had to make my list.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the 90s was, of course, a really bad decade for the Bengals, or the Bungles, as they were affectionately called.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that because if you remember, this, of course, was the draft where the Saints were going to give up their entire draft to get Ricky Williams, and
Yes.
they offered Cincy a chance to get it, and Cincy was Cincy passed on it because they already knew they wanted to get Smith, and it was probably one of the biggest mistakes they've ever made, and yeah, it just kind of capped off what ended up being a decade of futility for that franchise. You could argue that it wouldn't really be until a few years later when they brought in Carson Palmer that they finally started to kind of turn it around a little bit. So, yeah, he definitely is well deserving of being on a Mount Rushmore of draft busts. Keith, do you have anything else to say about Akili Smith?
No, I mean, I remember when they drafted him and kind of hoping that he was going to be that, not necessarily even the bridge. I think that when he was drafted, we thought he was going to be the next big thing. And so, and so, yeah, I remember him just kind of being a bust and just being sad again for Cincinnati.
Yeah, that might be a future potential Mount Rushmore. Which team has had more lousy draft picks? Because I know Cincy's up there, Cleveland's up there.
Yeah.
I mean, we could be here all night talking about that. But again, like I said, that's for a future Mount Rushmore. All right, well, I will go ahead and give Roger's last pick, and we'll go back to 1989. As I mentioned, when you look at that top 5 alone, you have Troy Aikman, Barry Sanders, Derek Thomas, and Deion Sanders, all 4 Hall of Famers. And then you have the guy who was drafted in number 2, but between Aikman and Barry Sanders, and that's Tony Mandarich. He was a guy, that everyone thought was, going to be the next big thing. He was hyped as one of the best offensive line prospects ever. You remember that infamous, I think it was Sports Illustrated. He was on the cover, and everyone thought, he was going to be, the guy to kind of be, one of the big pieces for Green Bay. He ended up, of course, flame out easily. Everyone remembers the infamous game that the Packers had with the Eagles, where Mandarich was trying to block Reggie White and got pretty much just thrown right on his ass.
Mm-hmm.
And he ended up flaming out quickly, though he would end up having a little bit of decent return in Indianapolis. Everyone, I think, doesn't remember that he actually was there after Peyton got drafted, so he was responsible for protecting him, and he did fine in kind of the close of his career. But obviously, when you think about his career, you think about the fact that he was, again, such a very highly touted prospect, and he ended up pulling out extremely quickly. So, another name that belongs on this Mount Rushmore. Keith, do you have anything else to say about Tony Mandarich?
No, not really. I mean, I think you pretty much covered everything I feel on that. Yeah.
Okay, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, he was referred to as the best offensive line prospect ever, which is, again, going to be really hard to live up to. I think that this was one of those situations where the kind of NFL combine and all of the pre-draft process really helped vault a guy up on draft boards, right? Because, he was drafted into the CFL the year prior in the 7th round, which should have been kind of telling if in the CFL, which was, pretty much considered, the second level, to the NFL. So if they're taking a guy in the 7th round and they can barely get enough players, that's usually telling. And then, the next year he's number 2 overall. The Incredible Bulk was what they called him, which was, great nickname for the time, but certainly didn't live up to it. I think the only reason I didn't put him on my list, well, there were 2. The first one being that he did, like you mentioned, Steve, he did end up having a decent renaissance with the Colts. I mean, he lasted 10 years, almost 10 years in the league. So hard for me to give a guy a bust label when he lasted that long. Not saying that he's not a bust, but he at least bounced back a little bit. And then the other one is, when I thought about NFL draft busts, I wanted to choose guys who kind of just didn't have the talent or didn't have the work ethic rather than the injuries. Mandarich did have a lot of injuries that kind of affected him early on. And I think a lot of his was also steroid use, which he admitted to. So, when you take the injuries out of it, I always think about it, if I'm playing like Madden and I turn the injuries off, things would be a lot different, and things would be a lot different for guys in sports if injuries were turned off. And so with Mandarich, I kind of give him a little bit of a mulligan because of that. But at the same time, again, when you're the only non-Hall of Famer in the top 5 of that draft, it's really hard to not be considered a bust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. That was, like you said, that was the big thing. It's like, he had this great physique, but, at that time, they were really cracking down on the steroid usage. So that definitely hurt him in the long run. So I'll definitely give you that one. All right. Well, Keith, you have one entry left on your Mount Rushmore. So why don't you go ahead and give it to us?
I do, and that is Reggie Bush. I think everybody remembers, Reggie Bush for not only his controversy with the Heisman Trophy, but then also just him coming in and getting drafted by the Saints, first round, second overall in the 2006 NFL Draft. And just, again, more flashes of brilliance from time to time. Never really came much more than that, though. I think, totals on him for, he even has decent, respectable numbers. I mean, he played 7, 9, 10, 11 years in the league, but still just kind of never really came to be the guy that I think all the hype was behind him. And so he just kind of fizzled out towards the end, and then just pretty much went into, I think, he moved on to do pretty good. He's like an announcer now for college football, which is kind of like where he belongs, I feel like, in the college football world,
Mm-hmm.
So Reggie Bush made a name for himself later on.
Yeah, that's an interesting one because I remember when he came in, everyone thought he was going to be the number 1 pick, and the Texans ended up going with Mario Williams, and like you said, the Saints ended up getting Bush, and like you said, he had a good little run with them. I mean, he's got a Super Bowl ring, so not a lot of busts can say that. And when you think about some of the other guys drafted in this class, I mean, you had Vince Young, Matt Leinart, Jay Cutler, a couple of other guys that could argue potentially could have been maybe bust, but you also have Vernon Davis, Ernie Sims. I mean, there is some good talent in this draft, and the fact that a lot of these guys didn't really, meet that level of expectations about it, is pretty disappointing. And like I said, Reggie Bush, he does have a Super Bowl ring to his credit, but he feels like a guy that definitely should have been a lot more than he ended up being. So that's definitely an interesting pick there. Scott, do you have anything else to say about Reggie Bush?
Yeah, I believe that Reggie Bush, unfortunately, was going to be a bust no matter what happened to him, no matter what he did in his career. Like, short of breaking Emmitt Smith's record as the all-time leading rusher, I think he would have been labeled a bust because there was so much hype behind him that he couldn't possibly have lived up to. He was so dynamic in college, unlike really anything we'd ever seen, because it wasn't just a running back, but in the return game and in the receiving game, just the all-around skill that he had. Most fun player to ever use on the NCAA college football games, I will say that. Love using Reggie Bush on those games because you put the ball in his hand and you scored a touchdown. Every single play, didn't matter, what defense you were going against. They stacked the line. It didn't matter. Scoring a touchdown every time. And so he came in with such high expectations, I don't think he was going to live up to. Right when he got drafted, he was second to Peyton Manning in the NFL when it came to endorsement deals. Pepsi, Adidas, Pizza Hut, Subway, all of that before he ever played a game. And so, to have all of that, anything short of being amazing, I think was going to be considered a bust. I do think he fell victim to teams not really knowing how to use him properly. The Saints at that time were running a lot of 2 and 3 running back systems. They had Deuce McAllister, they had Pierre Thomas, they had a couple other guys in there, and so they weren't giving him the ball enough to make a difference. Then he went to Miami when they were doing the Wildcat, offense, which again didn't, that's not suitable for a running back. And then he went to the Lions, who, hadn't had a good rusher since Barry Sanders, and just a lot of teams that I don't think knew how to employ him properly. And so I think he fell victim to that. But just a lot of hype. Glad that he lasted as long as he did, because I do think he was a dynamic player. But I think it was just insurmountable amounts of pressure for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I'll agree with that. All right, well, Scott, you're the only one that has anything left on your Mount Rushmore, so why don't you go ahead and give us your last pick?
Yeah, so, you brought up, Steve, teams that may be the worst when it comes to drafting, right? Whether it's the Bungles or the Cleveland Browns. I'm going to throw out another team because they just seem to miss in the early 2000s, and which led to them going 0-16 in the season. So the Lions in 2003, number 2 overall, drafted the last entry to my Mount Rushmore, and that's wide receiver Charles Rogers. He was the highest drafted wide receiver since Keyshawn Johnson back in 96, who went number 1 overall. So right there, when you're drafting a receiver that high, the expectations are that you're going to last more than the 3 seasons that Charles Rogers lasted in the league. And then to make matters worse, he was drafted 1 slot before Hall of Fame wide receiver Andre Johnson in 2003. So again, it's a Ryan Leaf situation where, not only were you bad, but the guy, that was drafted right there with you, the guy you're always going to be compared to as one of the all-time greats. Also in that draft is Carson Palmer, Jordan Gross, Terrell Suggs, Troy Polamalu, just a lot of great players. And so for him to be at the top, not to mention Anquan Bolden was in that draft, who is probably a top 25 receiver of all time, who went 40-something picks after Charles Rogers. So just a guy that just couldn't get open, had a lot of drops, a lot of issues off the field as well. Couldn't stay on the field, but it wasn't really health issues. It was more, again, I think a JaMarcus Russell situation where he just wasn't mature enough. I think he was drafted into a bad situation again. The Lions were a dumpster fire back then. 36 catches in his career and 4 touchdowns in 3 seasons, and then never played again. Is a huge bust at a time when there were just so many good wide receivers in football. Your Terrell Owens and Randy Moss and, Chad Ochocinco and Marvin Harrison. And this guy was supposed to be the next in line, and it was just a complete failure. So Charles Rogers, I wanted to have some variation and not just have all quarterbacks. So I went with Rogers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting choice. I'm not too familiar with him, but like you said, the fact
that's why he's a bust, Steve.
Yeah, So the fact that, like I said, he went, right before Andre Johnson, who went on to have a great career, just kind of speaks volumes for the type of career that Rodgers had. Keith, do you have anything else to say about Charles Rodgers?
Yeah, Charles Rodgers. I mean, I had been a fantasy football player for years, and when he was like always somebody that I would look at every single season, going, not that he played very long, but like, God, he has to be good. He has to be good. He never was. And you're absolutely right, Scott. He was touted as to be like one of the best, and he was going to be the next big thing. He was going to bring Detroit out of, obscurity, and no, nothing happened. It was a shame, but he was a Michigan guy. He grew up went to Saginaw, so I guess they had high hopes. And he passed away. He's gone now.
He did.
Yeah,
Rest
he
in
died
peace.
in 2019, so rest in peace.
Yeah, that's I didn't know that. That's unfortunate. So, okay,
he might be the only person on either of these lists that's passed away.
Maybe. I mean, you look at some of these other guys that some of the stuff they've done. You're amazed that they haven't that they're still alive.
Ryan Leaf's still alive, right?
Right. All right. Well, that will wrap up our main list. So let's go ahead and just touch on any honorable mentions that we haven't talked about yet. Keith, do you have any that you want to mention?
I do. Two of which is just really hilarious. Is one of them is Brady Quinn. And that's mostly because I don't know if you guys remember watching the draft. I think he was supposed to be. They thought he was going to go number 1 or maybe number 2. And he ended up getting drafted way down and then just did absolutely nothing. I mean, it's just Brady Quinn is just he was just irrelevant. Not even a bust. He's irrelevant, which is why he's kind of an honorable mention. I did put David Carr on that list. But really, I don't blame David Carr for being a bust because they did not build. I mean, it's got to be really tough being the franchise player for an expansion team, knowing that you're getting a lot of the not the best players from the other teams as well. And I feel like his offensive line was Swiss cheese. That poor guy couldn't get off the ground long enough to even throw a pass, but ultimately it led to him not being able to do much of anything in the NFL. And then the last guy on my list is just I've seen it again, this is kind of a personal pick, is Giovanni Carmazzi, who the only thing of note about him is that he was drafted by the San Francisco 49ers in the 3rd round of the 2000 draft. I believe he was the other quarterback that the Patriots were looking at kind of scouting. And it's just funny because his name goes into obscurity because Brady was drafted in the 6th round of the 2000 draft. So it's like they could have had Tom Brady in San Francisco, or the Patriots could have had Giovanni Carmazzi. And I've seen documentaries, or I've seen ESPN specials on him, and it's just kind of funny. Like, he was another one who I think that they had high hopes that he was going to be like the next Joe Montana, the next Steve Young, and he ended up being the first Giovanni Carmazzi. So, those are my honorable mentions there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do remember there was some good hype around Brady Quinn, and he, like you said, flamed out real quickly. Yeah, David Carr, I think, was in a tough position. Like you said, the Texans were an expansion team. They really didn't have much talent, and I think the expectations were, again, for him were just way too much for him to overcome. And then, I never even heard of Giovanni Carmazzi until you put it out there. So. Yeah, the fact that he went, 3 rounds before Tom Brady did, speaks volumes. So, all right. Well, Scott, do you have any other honorable mentions we haven't talked about yet?
I do. I'll first bring up, because we were talking about the Bungles earlier, I'll bring up Kajana Carter, number 1 overall running back in 1995. Again, his was more injury based, so it's really hard to say. He's more of a what if because he tore his ACL, in his first season there. But again, just another on the long list for the Bengals. Another one similar to Charles Rodgers is Justin Blackman for the Jaguars. He was a wide receiver, highly touted coming out of college. Only played 20 games. And then Courtney Brown, who was the number 1 overall pick for the Browns in 2000. Again, Brady Quinn was brought up, Tim Couch, Courtney Brown, just a long line of busts and guys who never reached their potential and their expectations with the Browns there. But for Courtney Brown to be number 1 overall defensive end and never have more than 6 sacks in a season that's pretty bad. Blair Thomas, who's a running back that was drafted by the Jets, number 2 overall. Heath Schuler, who's now better known for his political career, but he was drafted in the first round by Washington, and he's the guy that succeeded Mark Rippon and Doug Williams, who both won Super Bowls for the franchise, and he was supposed to be the next in line, and he lasted less than 5 years. Trent Richardson, running back, who never rushed for 1,000 yards. And then my last 2, one is Joey Harrington for the Lions, who was, drafted in 2002, kind of kicked off and jump-started that string of busts for the Lions. He lasted longer than he should have just because they had no one else that could play quarterback for them, but he was pretty bad with them. And then my last one has made more money than probably any of the names that we've mentioned during this portion of the podcast, and that's Sam Bradford. Who was drafted number 1 overall in 2010 and got $86 million guaranteed on his rookie contract. They had to change the rookie scale because of that contract. And a guy that never lived up to it got traded to Philadelphia, then to Minnesota, and pretty much was either hurt or throwing interceptions. That's all he did in his career. So he was someone that I had to bring up as well.
Yeah, those are all definitely some good picks there. I definitely agree about Bradford, and I know Richardson was another guy that seemed highly touted. I know, and again, when you talk about older guys, Heath Schuler, was another one. So those are definitely some good ones. A couple of other ones I was kind of looking at that we haven't mentioned. Yeah, when you talk about in terms of more recently, obviously you have to include Johnny Manziel. All the hype behind him, and going to Cleveland, Johnny football. Again, he was just another guy that flamed out extremely quickly. Do extremely well. Kind of the same vein as David Carr. I know you mentioned Tim Couch, another guy who was kind of called on to anchor a expansion team that was on the Browns at back, and again, he was kind of they didn't have a lot of talent. He was kind of seen as a guy to lead them to the big time, and he ended up kind of unfortunately flaming out again pretty quickly. Another guy that very heavily is the guy that goes franchise around Jeff George, drafted number 1 for the Colts, and there was a whole big deal around him coming in, and he ended up flaming out fairly quickly. And then one more. 88, Andre Bruce was drafted number 1. I know that was a year that there weren't a lot of quality, number 1 picks, and even though that was the same year that guys like Tim Brown and Sterling Sharp and Michael Irvin got drafted, I don't think they at the time were seen as number 1 pick. So for the Falcons to get him, who again he did fairly well, but not he was kind of seen as a guy that was going to be the next Lawrence Taylor, and he ended up kind of fizzling out fairly quickly. So those are some other guys that I thought deserved at least a little mention. All right, well, that will go ahead and wrap things up. It's been a lot of fun talking some great football players throughout the history of their careers, whether they were a number 1 pick or were they a draft bust. Before we go, let's go ahead and talk about where everyone can find you on social media and what we've got going on in terms of podcasts. Now, I'll just quickly mention for Roger, he of course does This Week in the NFL with his dad, Cowboy Senior, and Mr. D'Amato on the North-South Connection. A little bit of a hiatus, obviously, for now, but they, of course, will come roaring back once we get to the start of the NFL season. Keith, where can everyone find you on social media, and what do you got going on in terms of other podcasts?
So you can find me on social media. Twitter is Flounder824. You can also find me on the Facebook, and I've been as you had mentioned at the beginning, I'm all over the Pop Video Jukebox Song of the Day on the Pop feed here, and also you can hear me kind of on the North-South Connection, the Multiverse of Fabulousness. I can be heard every week on GFA Live with Pete, and I pop up here and there on other various forms of podcasting. So keep an eye out on my Twitter account. and I'll post stuff that I'm on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good stuff there. Scott?
Yeah, not too big on social media. I'm in the process of trying to, revamp and expand my sort of Twitter reach, just because it's not something that I partake in too often. But you can find me on Facebook at Scott Grimes, and then from there, kind of links to anything that I do. I do have some podcasts that I do. So over on the Pop feed here, I do Totally Rank, which is a newer podcast that I've been doing for a few months now. But essentially, it's kind of a total request live style show where myself and a guest will count down our top 10 songs from a particular year. So we started in 1980. We've dropped 1980, 1981, and 1982. Those episodes so far. I've had some great guests. There's been some great discussions. You kind of realize a lot of things when you start counting down the top 10 songs from a certain year. You see a lot of trends and a lot of different things. So I'm really excited to keep that going. So if you're a music fan, certainly go over to the Pop feed and check that out. In addition to that, some side projects that I do. I also have a sports trivia podcast called the Benchwarmers Trivia Podcast. We put out a couple episodes a week. So if you're like this episode and you're a sports fan, certainly give us a listen there. We do a great job of trying to have a nice variety, and it's a good time. So whether you're a hardcore sports fan or not, I think it's something that you can enjoy. So I'm looking forward to putting out more content in the future. So, go listen to Totally Rank and everything else that's over on the Pop feed, because I've pretty much become obsessed, and I really enjoy listening to all the shows. People work really hard, and I'm happy to be a part of it, and I'm excited for the future of where things are going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. As for me, you can usually find me here over on the Pop feed, not only with this show, but also Pop Goes to Classics, where me, Andy, and Miranda are going through all the Disney animated films. Our next episode, which should be coming up here very shortly, will, of course, be on Tarzan, as we hit the end of the Disney Renaissance and head into the kind of malaise of the 2000s. That's going to be an interesting time frame to talk about. Also, the Video Jukebox Song of the Day, along with Keith. Some great stuff going on over there with that. You can also find me over on the PTB Wrestling feed. Myself and James Grunberg have Extreme Resurrection, where we are going through the WWE revival of ECW. We are currently into the end of April 07 on the heels of on the verge of Backlash 2007. So very interesting to see how that show turns out and the fallout from that. Other than that, you can usually find me over on the PTP Facebook group. Lots of good discussions going on over there. Of course, our current tournament, where we are determining the greatest breakfast food of all time. By the time this episode drops, we will either into round 3 or just about to finish round 3 and start the Sweet 16. So some big names still on the table as we wait to see what will be named by PTB as the greatest breakfast food of all time. So be sure to get in and vote on that. With that said, guys, I thank you again for joining me. This was a lot of fun. I look forward to when we're able to do this again. And thank you all again for joining us. So for Keith Langston, Scott Grimes, and Roger Morrissette, I am Steve Riddle. This has been Making Mount Rushmore on the PTB Pop Experience. And we will see you next time.